Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Chapter 14 on extinction. Now, hope everyone is safe and healthy, and we're going to keep going with this unit. So we spent 3 lectures talking about functional assessment. We talked about all different kinds of functional assessment, including informant assessment, descriptive assessment that involves observation, and then, of course, the experimental functional analysis. I posted a lot of videos and articles and lots of resources for you to understand this very important unit or a very important chapter in trying to understand how to reduce problem behavior. Now we're going to be starting to talk about different procedures that may be used to decrease problem behavior. The first one of them is extinction. So when we talk about procedures to decrease behavior, we're going to be talking about first, at least for a while, we're going to be talking about all those functional and non-aversive treatments. Why are they functional and non-aversive? They're functional because we have conducted a functional analysis, and therefore the procedure to reduce problem behavior, we will address the function, or we would address the reason why the behavior is occurring in the first place. And it's non-aversive because none of the procedures that I will be describing in the next few classes involve the use of aversive stimuli. So no punishment or no negative reinforcement, at least not until we get to chapters on these topics. So the first procedure involves extinction, and that's the topic of the chapter and the lecture today. Then the next procedure that we'll talk about in the next chapter is differential reinforcement, and then of course, antecedent manipulations. Now, as I mentioned, they're functional because they're based on the information that has been gathered during the functional assessment, and the information that you get, of course, is about the causes of behavior or the antecedents and consequences that are responsible for keeping the behavior going, right? So if we then alter those antecedents or alter these consequences, then you should see a change in the behavior, right? So if the behavior is maintained by attention, and then you remove attention, or the behavior stops producing attention, or if the need to get attention, if you remove the antecedents, or you decrease or you change the motivation to get attention, that would involve changing the behavior in a functional way. Non-aversive, as I mentioned, because it doesn't involve any aversive stimuli or aversive manipulation. Now, these treatments are usually the first choice for decreasing problem behavior. It's not until functional non-aversive treatments have been tried several times that folks may consider the use of aversive treatments. We have a whole chapter on the ethics of using aversive treatments, and we'll talk about that later. But the progression always goes from using the least to most intrusive procedures. Now, as I mentioned, more restricted treatments may be used later, but again, only after functional non-aversive treatments have been demonstrated to fail. Okay, so this is also important. Usually, when we're dealing with decreasing problem behavior, the procedures that are going to be described in the next few chapters, they're oftentimes used together. They're being described separately for didactic purposes in a way, so you can understand each component perfectly. But oftentimes in practice, if we have a target behavior that we're trying to decrease, what happens is we do our functional assessment, we find out about the antecedents and the consequences responsible for the occurrence or the maintenance of the behavior. And then what we do is we may manipulate the antecedents to prevent the problem behavior from happening. We may eliminate the consequences so then the behavior stops happening. And we may also teach an alternative behavior to produce the consequence that used to be produced by the problem behavior. So we're doing antecedent, we're doing consequence intervention. So we're doing antecedent intervention, we're extinction of the problem behavior, and then reinforcement or differential reinforcement of an appropriate behavior. We often use all of these combined. There are a few situations that we may just use one manipulation, but often they're all mixed or used at the same time. But again, we're going to be talking about them separately so you understand them really well. And then throughout the semester, I'll give you examples in which all of these procedures are used at the same time. So it's important that you really understand these chapters and these concepts, because by the time we get to the end of the semester, we're going to be talking about all of them being used together. So if you have to really master all of them. Now let's talk about extinction again. You've been exposed to this principle before. When we were talking about the basic principles of behavior, we talked about positive and negative reinforcement, and then we talked about extinction. And in that context, we were talking about how behavior evolves, how we learn, and how behavior is maintained in a natural environment. Why do we do the things that we do, right? So if you wake up in the morning and you put makeup on, well, why do you do that? Well, because for a variety of reasons, but of course, the main reinforcer is that you put the makeup on and now you look nicer, you look prettier, you look younger, whatever it is. And then usually that's why that amount of work in the morning, it pays off, right? It might be a lot of work. It might take some time. Maybe you could have slept a few extra minutes if you didn't have to put makeup on. But hey, you wake up a little earlier, you're tired, and you still put the makeup on because that makes you look better. And you like the way you look, or you like the way other people look at you. Well, if that's the reason why you put the makeup on every morning, we could say putting the makeup on is a function of the consequence of looking prettier. Um, if for some reason you start putting makeup on and it doesn't work, the makeup doesn't make you look good, the behavior of putting the makeup on, or at least putting that specific makeup, may decrease, and that would be extinction taking place, right? So extinction is again withholding the maintaining reinforcer after problem behavior. So in the makeup example, the consequence just naturally stop happening is that if I put some, buy a new gel to put in my hair, on my hair, and then I do it, and then my hair looks terrible. So, my hair looked ugly, and then I put the product on, and then the hair continues to look ugly. So notice that there was no one actually intervening or trying to remove the reinforcer from my behavior. It was just a natural occurrence. I went and I bought this new gel for my hair, new product, and now it doesn't look very good. Now, naturally, I will decrease. The likelihood of buying that gel is going to be decreased, so the behavior will stop happening. Then again, natural example, or an example of extinction occurring in the natural environment. When I talked about extinction the first time around, I gave examples of foraging, right? So an animal may forage in a certain area to produce food, and then he continues going to that location because food is being produced. Well, that's an example of behavior maintained by positive reinforcement. Behavior, the animal doesn't have any food, he goes to a certain area, he produces food. Now, of course, if that area gets depleted, so there's no more food in that area, animal goes to that area, there's no more food. Now, what happens then? We talked about this. The animal may try to go there again. So you may see an increase in the behavior initially. So the animal may try to go to that area again, and there'll be no food. And then you go a second time and a third time. So you may see an immediate increase in the behavior. Now, the second thing that happens, you remember this, the second thing that happens is you may see an increase in novel behaviors. And that's important. So if there's no more food in that area, you may see the animal trying to go to a different area, or maybe trying to dig a little harder, maybe look around a little more. So you see novel behavior. You may see aggression-induced, extinction-induced aggression. So you may see aggression occurring, right? The same thing with the example of the vending machine. You're using the vending machine every day, and then one day you press the button and nothing comes out. Well, you may try to press the button several times. You may be a little pissed off, and so you get some aggression. You may hit the vending machine, but you also will try different things, right? Until eventually you stop doing it. So this is extinction at play in the natural environment. These are examples of extinction during everyday life. Sometimes your behavior works, sometimes your behavior doesn't work, and sometimes your behavior stops working altogether. And then if it does stop working altogether, it is to your benefit to actually try something new, right? And that behavior should stop occurring for good, right? So these are natural examples or day-to-day sort of examples of extinction. But the extinction procedure now that we know from studying how people learn and how human and animal behavior is maintained in the natural environment, we can borrow what we know from the natural environment and then use to design procedures to teach behavior and also design procedures to reduce behavior. So this is the case in which once we find the causes of a specific behavior, once we understand the consequences maintaining the behavior, then what do? We can implement extinction. So we can, now if we know what is the consequence, what is the reinforcer for a problem behavior, I can withhold the reinforcer for that problem behavior. I can no longer deliver the reinforcer, prevent the reinforcer from being delivered. And if I do that, and I combine with other interventions, I may see a decrease in the problem behavior, just like we see a decrease in any behaviors if they stop producing reinforcement. So again, like I mentioned, extinction is often combined with other interventions. And we have variations of extinction, of course. If behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement, then extinction would essentially consist of, eliminating the positive reinforcer. If it's social negative reinforcer, same thing, you'll be eliminating the social negative reinforcement. So social positive behavior occurs and produces something that is mediated by someone else. Well, the behavior will stop producing that, right? So the person delivering the reinforcer will stop delivering the reinforcer. Social negative, there's something aversive going on, problem behavior occurs, and get that something aversive removed, right? So the reinforcer is negative, something is present, behavior occurs, something is removed, but behavior increases because whatever it is that is removed makes life better, right? So it would be something bad is happening and I engage in problem behavior, that something bad goes away. Well, in this case, extinction would be that something doesn't go away. So the reinforcer is not being produced. So something bad is happening. So, maybe you ask me to do the dishes and I complain, and that's the problem behavior. And then you tell me like, okay, you don't have to do the dishes. So notice that complaining gets reinforced because complaining prevents me from having to do the dishes. So complaining is maintained by social negative reinforcement. So extinction of that will be essentially my complaining doesn't work anymore. So I have to do the dishes, I complain, and I still have to do the dishes. The behavior of complaining eventually would decrease because complaining doesn't work anymore. And of course, there might be extinction of automatic reinforcement. So we'll give some examples of that too. And remember, you may have positive or negative automatic, but again, automatic, usually the reinforcer is not being produced by someone else, is being produced by the outcome of the behavior. The behavior produces the reinforcer. No one needs to be around. We'll give examples of that. Now, there's what we call functional versus procedural application of extinction. Again, a functional application of extinction is the one that we're going to be talking about in the lecture, which involves identifying the reinforcer and then withholding the reinforcer. So then extinction being no longer presenting the reinforcer, right? So if you withhold the wrong consequence, right? So if you're not withholding the right consequence, then what do you think happens? The behavior is not going to decrease, and that's the procedural part, right? So you have to withhold the reinforcer, but it has to be the reinforcer identified in the functional analysis. If you remove the wrong reinforcer, the behavior will continue to occur, right? So, for example, Think about the thing that I just said earlier, the complaining about doing the dishes. So imagine my wife says, Kyle, I need you to do the dishes today. And I say, oh, but I'm really tired and I hate doing the dishes and I have to tape my lecture for 171. My life is so hard. I have so many things I need to do. So I start complaining. And then imagine my wife says, okay, then you don't have to do the dishes. You're very busy. I understand. So go tape your lecture and I'll do the dishes. And imagine that every time she asks me to do the dishes, I come up with some sort of excuse, complain about life, and then she does the dishes herself. Now, if that's the case, now think about it. What's the function of my behavior? If you were to do a descriptive assessment, you will find out, look, the majority of times when Kyle complains about doing chores, he doesn't have to do them. So his behavior is maintained by social negative reinforcement. So, okay, he has to do the chore, then he complains, then he doesn't have to do it. So what's the consequence? Well, the removal of the aversive event, the removal of the task or the demand. Okay, so what would extinction look like? He would be, well, the demand is not removed. Kyle has to do the dishes. He complains. He still has to do dishes. So notice his behavior didn't work. His behavior is not working. And if the behavior stops working, then the behavior goes away. Now, imagine someone doesn't do a functional analysis and just says, oh, Kyle's complaining, just ignore his behavior. Well, ignoring my behavior may essentially be my wife doesn't pay attention to what I'm saying, but if she continues doing the dishes after I complain, then my behavior will still occur. So she might just ignore what I'm saying, but that's not going to fix the problem. She needs to, implement extinction based on the function of the behavior. She needs to know the reason why the behavior is occurring. Well, the behavior is occurring so I can get rid of the problem. And then she needs to be able to implement extinction, which will be, well, my behavior doesn't get rid of the problem anymore. Behavior happens and I still have to do the dishes. So it's important to understand that extinction doesn't mean ignoring the behavior, right? Extinction means withholding the reinforcer, meaning the behavior doesn't produce the reinforcer anymore, right? So that's very important that you don't think that extinction means ignoring. Now, let's think about some of the examples that we talked about in the previous unit. So same examples. Let's see if we can understand what extinction would look like here. So you have a 4-year-old that tantrums. Now, when does the child do that? Well, requests are made by parents, right? The kid is playing with something preferred. Parents say, hey, I need you to go do the dishes. And then the kid says, well, I don't want to do it. And then the kid doesn't have to do it. That's the escape. So it's just like the example I just gave earlier with me and my wife. So here's social negative. So what would extinction look like? We already talked about kid. The consequence is no longer produced, meaning the kid doesn't escape from the request. The kid still has to perform the task. And eventually behavior would decrease. Now, another kid engaging tantrums now for a different reason, right? The kid wants something and parents say you can't have it. The kid throws herself on the floor and then eventually gets what she wants. Now, remember, what is the consequence here? Is it positive or is it negative? It's positive. Is it reinforcement? So then, of course, positive reinforcement. In this case, is in the form of a tangible. Tantrum produces what the child wants. What would extinction look like? Remember, consequence is eliminated. So the tantrum doesn't produce the reinforcer. Now, I'm not saying here that these procedures should be utilized, right? Or that these procedures would actually work. I'm just telling you this is what it will look like. I'm gonna talk to you about later whether or not extinction should be used in some of these examples. But right now, just for us to understand what extinction theoretically would look like, let's just come up with how extinction would be implemented theoretically in those situations. Now, 10-year-old pulling his hair. When does it happen? When he's alone, when he's having negative thoughts and emotions, he pulls his hair and then he relieves, there's a relief from negative thoughts and emotions. Now, extinction would be if pulling the hair doesn't produce the relief from negative thoughts and emotions. Now, is it possible to do that? Probably not, right? You probably cannot make the relief of the negative thoughts and emotions go away in this example. But if extinction could theoretically be implemented here, it would be that pulling hair would not produce anything. It would not change how the person is feeling. 6-year-old with autism waves her hand. Again, the consequence is visual stimulation. So child might just, do something with her hand, and that produces visual stimulation. Now remember, the consequence here is an automatic reinforcer. So there is nothing happening in the environment. Child waves her hand, and now she gets this visual stimulation. What would extinction look like? It would be theoretically waving the hand no longer produces visual stimulation. Now, is it possible to do that? Is it possible to get a child who does this and produces visual stimulation to continue to do this, but not produce visual stimulation? Probably not, right? I mean, what would you do? Put a bandana around the kid's eye, like, doesn't, uh, uh, shut the child's or the person's eye. You can't do that. So theoretically, it would be the behavior doesn't produce visual stimulation, but of course, you can probably do that in reality. So in this case, extinction, theoretically, that's what it would look like, but you wouldn't be able to implement it. Another example, pulling the hair, and it's important that you understand that some cases extinction cannot be used, because that's going to be one of the determinants of whether or not extinction should even be considered as an intervention. Now think about this one. 17-year-old is alone, pulls her hair, manipulates the hair, and that produces tactile stimulation. Again, what is the consequence? Is this feeling that the hair produces. Now, can you eliminate that feeling when the child pulls her hair? You can't. I mean, what would you do? Would you numb someone's hand so you cannot feel the hair? That's not a reasonable or ethical intervention. You couldn't even do that. So don't even think about the possibility of intervening by using extinction in this case. Now, theoretically, if you could eliminate the tactile stimulation, the person would stop pulling the hair, because if pulling the hair produces that nice sensation, if that nice sensation goes away, you stop pulling the hair. Now, here is one in which you could implement extinction. Now, someone pulls other people's hairs, and that produces attention. What kind of attention? We talked about that last class. Probably someone saying, stop doing that, or saying something, right? Yelling at the 17-year-old teenager here. Now, if that's the case, if we find out through a functional analysis that, hey, the teenager pulls other people's hair because of the reaction that he or she gets from other people, then extinction here would be no longer giving a reaction, right? No longer producing a reaction. That would be what extinction would look like. Now, the question is, can you actually do that? So I'm saying, well, in this case, it's probably more feasible to do it than in the example above. But again, it might be difficult to do it, because if I'm pulling someone's hair because I want to see their face of desperation, of their face of pain, it's very difficult to avoid producing the consequence, right? So I'm going to do it and people are going to react. There's an example of, and I may have told you guys this before, and if I did, I apologize, but I've been bitten severely on my leg by one of the clients that I work with disabilities, and it hurt like hell. And the consequence for biting was not only the fact that that specific child in the past have been able to remove and postpone the task. So it was in many ways social negative reinforcement, but also the reaction that the bite produced on other people, because immediately people would say ow, and then they would cry or yell or walk away, and that for some reason was reinforcing to the client. But also the client would escape the task. Now, it's very difficult to implement extinction in this case because, and I did, but when the child bit me, I was like, there are tears coming down my eyes, but I continue implementing the procedure. So I didn't remove the task. So I didn't give the negative reinforcer, nor did I react, which is very difficult not to do that. It's very difficult not to react when someone bites you. But I didn't react. I mean, again, I was like crying silently, but I was still presenting the tasks. And that was hard to do. So in many ways, we might not be able to implement extinction here because, if someone pulls other folks' hairs, it's very difficult for them not to react to. 8-year-old biting his or her wrist. Here we talked about this during toothbrushing, and it involves escape from the toothbrushing task. Now, there are two problems here, remember. The reinforcer is that the child escapes from the task, and also escapes from the pain. So again, in this case, we'll probably have to, not let the child escape from the task, but we of course would not want the pain to stay in there. So we will probably have to treat the child's gums, which will be some sort of a antecedent manipulation in this case. Then finally here, self-scratching. Again, you're relieved from the itch skin. Again, impossible to implement extinction here because when you scratch, the itch goes away. If you scratch and the itch doesn't go away, then eventually scratching would stop happening. Okay, so those are some examples of extinction, and I think it's important that in a lot of our examples, extinction would actually not be practical, right? It's not something that we would consider actually using. So when do we use extinction? Well, just like before, the first thing we need to do is implement some data collection system, define the behavior, and of course, after we conducted the functional assessment, identify the reinforcer for the problem behavior, then we would have to eliminate the reinforcer for the problem behavior. So as simple as that. You identify the behavior, you conduct a functional assessment, and then once you conduct a functional assessment, to implement extinction, you have to eliminate the reinforcer. However, you have many things that you have to take into consideration before extinction could be considered. Well, first of all, have you identified the reinforcer, right? Remember, you can't just say, let's ignore the behavior and the behavior will go away. That would only work if the behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement in the form of attention. Then if the behavior occurs because it produces attention, then eliminating attention or ignoring the behavior will get the behavior to disappear. But for all other functions, ignoring the behavior could potentially make the behavior worse. There's a nice article that I will post on Canvas, and I just thought about that article, in which they actually show that sometimes when you use extinction incorrectly, the behavior doesn't change, but in some cases it's problematic, right? It actually makes the behavior worse. So I'm going to post that article there. You can browse through it if you're curious. Now, the question is, can you eliminate the reinforcer? Is the reinforcer under your control? So in many of the examples that I gave earlier of automatic reinforcement, you can't really make the feeling of the hair in someone's hand not reinforcing. If that's reinforcing for that person, there's nothing really you can do about that. If I like to sing in the shower and that annoys everyone, But the reinforcer is just hearing myself sing. You cannot eliminate that reinforcer. Every time I sing, I'm going to produce that reinforcer. So you have no control over the reinforcer. If you have no control over the reinforcer, then there's nothing you can do. You cannot use extinction in this case. Now, is it safe to use extinction? Now, I think the book gives an example of someone who engages in severe aggressive behavior to produce escape from the tasks. Now, can you really go through the process of getting the person to engage in aggressive behaviors, and then the consequence is escaping from the task? What would extinction look like? The person engages in aggressive behavior, and then you don't eliminate the task. The task is still being presented, so the person has to continue engaging in problem behavior. You may not want to implement extinction in this case because you don't want the person to even engage in the dangerous behavior in the first place. And even if the person engages in this dangerous behavior, then once you remove the reinforcer, you're going to see the behavior get worse. And that what we refer to as the extinction burst, right? So we're going to see not only the behavior occur again and again and again, but get worse, right? Novel behaviors are going to occur. And you may not be able to tolerate an extinction burst, right? Imagine self-injury. Can you really, even if self-injury is maintained by attention, and you eliminate attention, do you really want to see self-injury increase before it decreases? Can you really tolerate an immediate increase in behavior before behavior decreases? Well, if you have behaviors like eye poking, can you really see eye poking increase? By the time behavior goes away, the client's already blind. You can't do that. It is unethical to put the client through a procedure that would generate more problem behavior that endangers the client or endangers others. So you can't really use extinction in cases like that. Here's an important part. Can you be consistent? Now, I, in many ways, find extinction to be a difficult procedure to implement. And it is difficult because oftentimes if you have to rely on other folks to implement extinction, especially in the natural environment, they may not be able to be consistent. They may not be able to eliminate the reinforcer every time the behavior occurs. So imagine we find out that the child engages in tantrum because every time the kid cries and throws himself on the ground and and makes a scene, then the child gets what she wants. Now we do the functional assessment, we find out exactly what the problem is, and then we implement the procedure in the laboratory, and then we make some recommendations and tell folks who are around the kid and say, look, whenever the kid engages in problem behavior, you can't really give in. You cannot reinforce the behavior. And a week later, you visit that family and you ask them, hey, listen, how has extinction been going? And they say, well, we've been implementing it as much as we can. When they say that, they're essentially telling you, well, sometimes we did it, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. So what are they telling you? They're telling you that sometimes the behavior occurred and produced a reinforcer because they couldn't really implement extinction, so the child got what you wanted. And sometimes the behavior occurred and it did produce extinction, meaning the child didn't get what you wanted. So what's happening here is that the behavior is being reinforced intermittently, right? So what do we know about intermittent reinforcement? Does it make it less or more resistant to extinction? It makes the behavior more resistant to extinction. So now the behavior may potentially be harder for us to decrease or harder for us to get rid of because you have a behavior that sometimes gets reinforced, sometimes it doesn't. So once you try to actually be consistent and implement extinction, then you're going to have a problem. Behavior is going to be very resistant. It will be very difficult to eliminate that behavior. And that's essentially point number 4, right? If the behavior has been reinforced intermittently, it will make the behavior more resistant to extinction. And of course, if it follows continuous reinforcement, then it might be less resistance to extinction, right? So again, we talked about this before. If behavior is being reinforced every single time, and then now you move on to a condition in which the behavior is not reinforced at all, which is the extinction condition, there is, of course, a great disparity between conditions, easier to discriminate conditions, and of course, we have less generalization from a condition in which behavior was being reinforced every time to a condition in which behavior is never reinforced. These conditions are very different from one another. But if you have a condition in which the behavior is being reinforced once in a while, intermittent reinforcement, there are many situations in which the behavior doesn't produce any reinforcement during the intermittent reinforcement schedule, right? So imagine behavior occurs on a variable ratio 10. Then on average, the behavior gets reinforcement after every 10th time. So, there might be 9 behaviors that don't produce any reinforcement, and then boom, one behavior occurs, produces reinforcement. There might be 15 behaviors without reinforcement, and then boom, another behavior occurs, gets reinforcement. So again, on average, every 10th behavior, there's a reinforcer. Now, you move to an extinction condition. Extinction behavior would occur and not get reinforcement. Second behavior would occur, not get reinforcement. Now, that participant, that individual is used to a condition in which behavior didn't get reinforced all the time. So the condition from intermittent reinforcement to extinction, they're kind of similar. So you see some similar generalization. You see behavior continue to occur during the extinction if it followed intermittent reinforcement. So that's something important here. I'll talk about a strategy that the authors talk about in the book, and I've done a study on it, and I'll show you in a second in a few slides. Okay, we already talked about this. Another important feature here is that usually when we use extinction, we never use extinction alone. Very rarely, I've never used extinction alone, meaning if you're going to eliminate the reinforcer for the problem behavior, the participant still finds that reinforcing finds that reinforcer effective, needs that reinforcer. There's a motivation to obtain that reinforcer. So if the motivation is there, then the individual may find other ways that could be problematic as well to produce that reinforcer. So imagine I live in an environment in which there's not a lot of attention, and I learn to engage in problem behavior to get the attention. That means that attention is very valued as a reinforcer. If you put that behavior under extinction, meaning I need the reinforcer, I engage in the problem behavior, and I don't get the reinforcer, well, the behavior will decrease, but I still need the reinforcer. The reinforcer is still valued. So what am I going to do? I might develop a new problem behavior that would produce the reinforcer. So instead, what we do is we're still going to give the reinforcer that is valued by the client, but we're going to give the reinforcer now for an appropriate, for a desirable behavior. What desirable behavior? Well, one that we're going to have to potentially teach, and that's going to be the topic of the next class. So we may have to reinforce an alternative behavior that produces the same reinforcer as the problem behavior. And then, of course, we have to take steps to promote generalization. So extinction is used in all relevant circumstances, so the behavior just doesn't decrease in the presence of one person or in certain environments. So that's why extinction needs to be used by everyone at all times, and it needs to be used over time after the problem behavior has already been decreased, so you don't see problem behavior reemerge, right? So let me tell you about this study that we've done now many years ago. It's kind of old. This study, it was based on this recommendation that people would say, hey, listen, if problem behavior in the natural environment is maintained by intermittent reinforcement, right? Oftentimes problem behavior, is reinforced just once in a while. And then if we put the behavior under extinction, it's going to take a long time for the behavior to decrease. So what if problem behavior is occurring, is reinforced on a variable ratio schedule of some sort of an intermittent reinforcer? Before we put the behavior under extinction, what if we reinforce the behavior every single time it occurs? So we put the behavior on a continuous reinforcement schedule before we put it under extinction, right? Would that make extinction go faster? So if behavior is maintained on an intermittent reinforcement schedule, instead of placing it under extinction right away, what if we get this behavior that is under intermittent reinforcement, reinforce it continuously, reinforce every time it happens, then put it under extinction? Can we make this extinction that follows continuous reinforcement be faster? So we had that question in mind, and the studies that have tried to do this have produced mixed results. So we decided to do a laboratory study to answer this question. And the laboratory study involved these specific phases. So let me show you here the graph, and then you can see you have 3 panels. We have 3 kids, top one Bob, then Alan, and then Mike. Now we have responses per minute in the y-axis, and then we have sessions in the x-axis. So here, the behavior that we were looking at, this was a laboratory study. So we had typically developing kids who were trying to model what would happen with problem behavior. But we weren't dealing with problem behavior here. We're simulating problem behavior in the laboratory. So those kids were asked to put tokens, like, poker chips, into this bucket. So it was a very, boring kind of behavior. And it was a behavior that we pretended was like a problem behavior, right? So as you can see, we put the behavior, let's look at the top panel here for Bob. We put the behavior on a variable ratio reinforcement. So behavior wasn't occurring very much. Then we started giving reinforcement, and I don't remember what it was. I think it was like praise we're giving to the kids. And as you can see, behavior increases, and it stays pretty stable at about 6 to 10 responses per minute. So this is the problem behavior, right? This is the problem behavior, or simulating problem behavior, on a variable ratio 5. Then what did we do? Well, we now did the intervention. The intervention was to get this behavior and reinforce every single time it occurs, right? So let's get the problem behavior that in the natural environment, again, simulating the problem behavior in the natural environment. So pretend this is the problem behavior in the natural environment on a variable ratio 5. So it gets reinforced on average every 5th time it occurs. Then let's put the behavior in a fixed ratio 1 or in a continuous reinforcement schedule. So now every time the behavior occurs, it produces reinforcement. You see that behavior stabilizes at a lower level, at least for Bob. Now let's put the behavior under extinction and see what happens. Notice that there is some extinction burst, right? So there is some resistance to extinction. We were hoping that by putting the behavior on a fixed ratio 1 or on a continuous reinforcement schedule, that we wouldn't see a lot of that. They would see a rapid decrease in behavior. Well, it took about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sessions until we see a reduction in behavior. Then we put the behavior back into a VR5, got the behavior pretty stable, and then put the behavior under extinction. Remember, right? After VR5, the behavior should be more resistant to extinction, but it's not. Behavior goes down very quickly, and probably because it was the second extinction, right? So the second extinction makes the behavior faster, but we are trying to counteract that, because if fixed ratio was a good procedure, then behavior should have been faster here than here, but it wasn't. Then we tried with another participant. Let's see what happens. We do VR5, the intervention, which is continuous reinforcement, then extinction. Do we see an immediate reduction? No, we see a burst. We see an immediate reduction after VR5. We shouldn't. It should be more resistant here, less resistant here. But we see the opposite. So this intervention doesn't seem to work, does it? Well, let's try to replicate with a third child. Thinning, right? So here's we go from fixed ratio 1 until we get to VR5. That's what the thinning means. It means how long it took to get the behavior to a VR5 schedule. Behavior gets pretty stable. We put it on a continuous reinforcement, reinforcing the behavior every single time. Let's see if that makes extinction go faster. Well, it takes a long time for extinction to be reached. Then we put it back on a VR5. Now, no continuous reinforcement schedule goes from a VR5 to an extinction. What do we get? Same thing, it's faster here. So we did not see in our laboratory study, we have not seen fixed ratio 1 or continuous reinforcement as an intervention make the behavior less resistant to extinction. We didn't see that. All we saw is that the second extinction tends to be faster. And previous studies, there was a previous study that we were following up on, and they found very similar results. They found that extinction actually was always faster when it was the second extinction, and then using this interpolated reinforcement or fixed ratio 1 interpolated between VR5 and extinction didn't really do anything even when it was applied in the second extinction or the first or the second. So we don't think that this is a good recommendation. We do know, however, that in the natural environment, when the behavior is maintained by intermittent reinforcement, it takes longer for the behavior to extinguish. But the idea that if you're going to reinforce the behavior every single time before you place it under extinction, the idea that this is going to do any good, well, it has been debunked in a couple of studies, including this one that we've published in 2012. Okay, well, that's all I have for today. This is a relatively short chapter. Please read the chapter. I mean, I'm going to be posting also an article that I mentioned earlier about using extinction incorrectly and the effects that it might have upon the reduction or no reduction of problem behavior. And again, if you have any questions, post it on the discussion board, send me an email. Tomorrow or Monday, I'm recording this Sunday, so Monday I have office hours. If you go to the Zoom, you might be placed in a waiting room, and be patient. I'll get to you eventually. If you don't want to be patient, or if you don't want to wait for too long and you want to shoot me an email, I can try to arrange a time for us to meet and make things easier for you. Again, thanks for the feedback. Those of you posting feedback about those videos in the discussion session. I apologize for not editing those videos. I know I make some mistakes. I go back but I think that's that's what lecture is like. So I wanted to be as real as possible. And again, I don't have the opportunity to look at your guys' faces and see whether or not you're puzzled by my comments. But again, you can go back, you can rewatch certain sections of my lecture, and please post questions if you have any. And if you want to test out some examples that you may have and see if your examples are correct, I'll be more than happy to give you some feedback. Hopefully I can see you guys before the end of the semester. That's probably not going to be the case, but we'll communicate somehow. All right. Have a good one, and I'll see you guys sooner, hopefully. Bye.